I've always done low-tech planted tanks with no carbon dioxide or CO2 injection, no high light, and no crazy fertilization schedule because it's easier and cheaper, right? Right? Find out what I learned when I added a pressurized CO2 system to this aquarium and whether or not I think it's worth it. I'm Irene with Girl Talks Fish, here with practical tips on nanofish and planted aquariums. And every year I like to do some kind of really different aquarium setup where I learn something major. For example, with the Shy Guys jungle tank, I learned how to keep shy fish that don't hide all the time. And then for the Back to Basics planted tank, I learned how to finally beat algae and balance a low-tech planted aquarium. The reason why I've stayed away from high-tech setups for so long is because it just seemed really complicated. Like there's a lot of advanced technology terms I wasn't familiar with, and I still needed to learn how to balance a low-tech tank using kind of just the light and nutrient levers without the complexity of adding the CO2 lever as well. Plus, it just seemed like the wild, wild west. A lot of it seemed very like DIY, you know, get your parts from here, but don't get that part from there. You could make your own CO2 system. I decided to go just with a pressurized system up front because from the research I did, it seemed a lot more reliable and it would require less time and effort on my part. There's also money as a factor. You know, it already costs several $100s to set up an aquarium, even more money if it's a planted aquarium, and then add on that pressurized CO2 component and that's several $100s more. Plus, I kind of heard some horror stories of what happens when like the CO2 cylinder accidentally, you know, pushes all the rest of its CO2 into the tank, or you leave that regulator on too long and you end up basically suffocating and killing all your fish. Ugh, definitely don't want to do that. The reason why I decided to give CO2 a shot, even though it is more high maintenance, and you'll often hear low-tech supporters say things like, oh, the plants, they just grow way too fast, you're constantly having to prune them or dump tons of fertilizer into the water and it's just not worth it. For me, even when I balance a low-tech tank, there's no algae, but the plants just seem kind of stalled and sometimes even struggling a little bit, and I need the help. I honestly think it's my tap water. So I did a little research on my wastewater treatment plant, and they use basically kind of like an industrial commercial water softener on our city's water. It's not the same process, it's a lime slurry, but it basically strips all the minerals, the good minerals out of the water, and it raises the pH, which to me seems like the worst of both worlds. But whatever, maybe if I can just limit the light, limit the CO2, it won't grow out of control, but it'll be just enough to get over that hump so that my plants are actually growing a little bit. Plus, maybe then I could try some new plants that I haven't been able to try before that require higher lighting settings, like certain red plants or carpeting plants. Now, this is not a step-by-step instructional video on how to set up a CO2 system, but I will tell you briefly, after I did some research, here is my shopping list of everything I thought I needed. The one thing that was not as clear was how big of a CO2 cylinder to get, because everywhere online seemed to say like, get the biggest tank you can, you know, 20 pounds, you'll never regret it, you'll never run out, you know, I mean, you won't run out, but you won't have to change it out as often. But that seemed really big. So for a 20-gallon tank, I talked to my coworker, Lizzie, who is really into high-tech setups, and she was like, yeah, if you're gonna just run it minimally, you could get a 5-pound cylinder and only have to change it out twice a year. So I was like, all right, I'm good to go. I first went to a commercial welding company and they quoted me like $135 for a cylinder. And then I searched around some more and found a mom and pop store that was like this home brewery supply place, and it was only $100. Plus, they will do refills for $15 each time and give you back the same cylinder rather than a beat up other cylinder that somebody used. Pretty much everything else I just order from CO2 Art. They've got this nice like kit system that you can set up. And then I'm not sponsored by them, but AquaPros has a promo code that I use. So thank you, Mike. Finally, I also got a sample CO2 regulator from Aquarium Co-Op to test, which Corey's already shown on camera during one of his live streams. We didn't go with that particular product, but the overall cost ended up being a total of $350 for a basically brand new CO2 setup. So let's finally talk about my first impressions. I'm gonna split it up into two categories. How did the equipment do versus how did the aquarium plants themselves do? So for the equipment, I started off installing that cheaper sample regulator I got, and that was a nightmare. Like obviously that was my first time ever installing a CO2 system, so I had no idea what I was doing, but the regulator itself, I could not tighten it onto the cylinder without the dials just hitting the cylinder, and then I couldn't keep rotating it to attach it properly. And plus the manual that was provided wasn't really detailed at all, so I ended up having to download instructions for another regulator that were online, and then I had to try to piece together what pieces of information I could use to apply to this regulator that I was trying to install. Lots of hours of sweat and frustration, but once I finally got it installed, I had a bubble counter on it, and I set it for approximately 1 bubble per second. And then I already had a Fluval 3.0 LED light that can go to highlight settings. And so currently it's set about 30% intensity for 10 hours a day, but I'm continuing to adjust that. 3 months after installation, that cheaper regulator I was using started intermittently buzzing. Like anytime it was on, it would be like zzz. I think I have a recording of it here. I looked online, there's several reasons why this could be happening. I was like, you know what? I already have that more expensive CO2 ART regulator that I ordered originally, so let's install that. The installation was much easier. It was clearly a higher quality product, so that is what I'm currently using now, and hopefully I won't have any problems with it either. Finally, now that it has been 3 months, I noticed that the diffuser in the back is kind of getting clogged up. Not as many bubbles are coming out despite having the same kind of bubble count level. So I found out after doing some research online, sometimes it's helpful to have 2 CO2 diffusers so that when the first one gets clogged up, you install the second one, keep that CO2 running, and then you can clean the first diffuser using kind of a diluted bleach solution and then let it completely dry before you use it again. As for the plants, you can see they did great. Oh my goodness, the Aponigeton crispus and the dwarf aquarium lily, they were pretty much stunted for months on end. Looked like fake aquarium plants. They never grew. And then once I added CO2, they finally grew leaves all the way to the surface. The stem plants, they were also stunted in growth, and you can see the bacopa is doing well, as well as the water wisteria finally converted successfully. The Java ferns, I felt like were losing fewer leaves. They weren't turning brown and gross anymore. And then I didn't really see much difference with the cryptocorynes. They kind of stayed about the same size. As for which plants kind of grew out of control the most, well, clearly you can see the Pogostem encellatus octopus is very, very dense and thick. Actually, this is the first time I've been able to colony breed besides the corridors, but colony breed the platies. They're really voracious about going after their fry, and now there's enough plants in here where the fry are finally surviving. So looks like I'm gonna have to make another trip to the fish store sometime in the future to rehome them. But between the Pogostem encellatus and then the dwarf aquarium lily, as well as the Aponigeton, the 3 of them were just shading out all of the other plants down below. And then the bulb plants in particular, they were basically, anytime I would stop feeding them root tabs every single week, they would show their displeasure by melting back their leaves. And I was like, okay, this is too much. The Aponigeton in particular is eating me out of house and home. So I ended up removing it and giving it to my local fish store, Exotic Aquatics. And when I measured it, the longest leaves were 26 inches long, and then it grew a flower stalk, which this was the first plant that ever flowered for me. That stalk was 36 inches long, so clearly too big for this aquarium. As for algae, I used to have to, when it was a low-tech balanced setup, I still had to scrape off green spot algae or green dust algae, whatever that was on the front panels and sides, at least every like 1 to 2 weeks. But ever since I added CO2, it's pretty much completely disappeared. I do have a problem with black beard algae on that sponge filter in the back, and that's because it's right under the light and there's not a lot of plants blocking the shade on it. So clearly I have some adjusting to do with the lighting and CO2 situation, and I might need the help of a little bit of easy carbon, liquid carbon to solve that problem. So is it worth it? And for me at least, that's a definite yes. Mainly because I told you before, my water is not great and the plants were going way too slowly, even in a balanced low-tech aquarium. And then B, I am a full-time working adult, so I have the budget for it. I would say I'm doing more of a medium tech setup because it's very low light still, low amounts of CO2, low amounts of fertilizer. So for me, that's great. Do I plan on converting my other tanks to high tech? Maybe? I mean, for the 10-gallon tank, it's sitting on the kitchen counter, so there's no really good place to put a CO2 cylinder that wouldn't get constantly kicked. And then the 5-gallon tank, well, it's currently going through a brown diatom algae bloom, mainly because I just had to restart it after poisoning my betta tank, which you may have heard about. And then I think $350 for a brand new CO2 system would be a little too much to spend on a 5-gallon tank for a betta fish that is just my office tank, versus this is a 20-gallon display aquarium full of community fish that the whole family can enjoy. If you missed my whole story on how I accidentally poisoned my betta fish tank, you can see it over here. Otherwise, take time to enjoy your aquariums, and I'll see you in the next video.